Okay, so for this week, we are looking at how we learn about gender and not just about what genders are and what genders are present in our culture, but all of the different ways of behaving and thinking and acting and feeling that are appropriate within to our gender within a cultural lens. So that's really what we're focusing on when we talk about gender and socialization, but we're also going to talk about enculturation as well. And so one of the other things we're going to talk about that builds upon last week's topic is parenthood, motherhood, and fatherhood. And we're going to look at how those roles and performance of those roles is very much shaped by our gender ideologies. And then finally, we're going to talk about the media. And I'm not going to say a lot in this video about the media because I have a feeling that you're going to have a lot to say when we get together as a group. Okay, so some key terms here. So even though in our culture and in many cultures around the world we're assigned a sex and a gender at birth, we still need to learn what that means. And so we can refer to the two processes, learning processes, as socialization and enculturation. So as defined here, socialization is where we're learning the skills that we need to successfully interact with other members of the social groups to which we belong. And note that it's social groups broadly. Because what are appropriate ways of acting and what our appropriate skills are needed are going to vary based on the different kinds of groups that we are members of, right? And then enculturation is the learning process by which we come to terms with the ways of thinking and feeling that are considered appropriate in our respective cultures, right? So socialization, focusing on skills, on interaction, enculturation, focusing on coming to terms with thinking and feeling. And so because of these two processes by which we learn what having a gender means and what gender differences mean, we think of this or refer to this then as the cultural construction of gender, right? That humans learn ways, and I apologize, I don't have very gender inclusive language on here, but we do have ways of learning how to behave under a heteronormative framework as a man or a woman, and to recognize behaviors as masculine or feminine within their cultural context. And of course, we can adapt this definition to be more inclusive, and I'd encourage you to do so on the course wiki, thinking about how then when we think about learning about our genders from a cultural perspective, how if an individual doesn't feel that their gender is accurately captured by their culture, if they're not, if what they're feeling and what they're thinking seems to be at odds with what their gender is presenting, that this can cause tension, right? And stress and discomfort and anxiety and a whole bunch of other consequences of that as well. Okay. So how are we socialized into gender? How do we learn about gender? Well, you can imagine all of these different mechanisms, right? Of course, our kin, including both our family and friends, recall last week's topic, the media, which we'll talk a little bit about in this week's topic, but also when we come back to talk about power and equity and inequality. Once again, we'll see how this plays out. We've seen how maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, how doctors can also shape our understanding of gender, because doctors play such a critical role, as we saw way back when in week 2 in defining our sex, that this has consequences then in terms of our gender and our understanding of gender as well. Of course, all the different educational institutions that we pass through in our lives, religious communities. Today we'll talk a little bit about sports. And we've also seen how legal frameworks have regulate things like sexuality, and you can then see how, by extension, they would also regulate gender more broadly. Right? And so the consequence of all of these different ways of learning, especially if all of these different structures and institutions teach the same sorts of ideas about gender, these ideas then not only become normative, but then they seem natural to us, right? That we seem like, oh, this is just the way things are. But what I hope is coming clear from this course is that different cultures teach different things about gender. So what is natural to one culture is unnatural in others, right? So what this cross-cultural comparison tells us is that gender indeed is taught, it is learned, it is reinforced, therefore it is something that is nurtured and also enforced, right? And this is from that legal perspective. We can also think about how we learn gender passively through seeing it performed all around us. And so we learn to perform it appropriately in turn. And so this is why I wanted to focus on parenthood in particular, is that this is one of the key avenues of gender performance that has consequences in terms of how we learn the appropriate ways of acting and of thinking, of feeling as a gendered individual in our culture, right? As we learn from our parents. So one of the ways that I wanted to kind of approach this idea of learning about gender was, again, by looking at a cross-cultural perspective. And so I selected this reading by Gilmore in your text. So again, what it is looking at is, and I also intentionally selected it because up to now, a lot of the readings have focused on women, on females, on things like motherhood, right? So we had our readings around surrogacy and pregnancy and birth. But now I wanted to shift and focus on conceptions and conceptualizations of manhood and of masculinity. And so that's what Gilmore is looking at with this article. What I like about this reading as well is that Gilmore begins it with that narrative, right? So explaining how ethnography actually works in the real world, right? So Gilmore went to Andalusia in Spain with an idea of studying one thing, but then through their observations of just living and being immersed in that culture, start to make some other observations regarding, as stated here, what makes a real man, what is manliness, what is machismo, but also how it's then understood to be a cultural fact. And we can think about cultural facts as being, again, a way that we naturalize certain behaviors, attitudes, ways of thinking, etc. Right? But what Gilmore emphasizes is the nuances of manhood, that it can be defined in a number of different ways. So they talk about the three components of virility, valor, and virtue, talks about how in this construction, manhood becomes a system of checks and balances, or do's and don'ts, right? That what men in Andalusia then are basically forced to make their decisions on the basis of this kind of checklist of what is and is not appropriate behaviors, ways of speaking, ways of engaging with members of the other sexes, so etc. Right? So we can talk about this in the Blackboard session this week, but I think what really shines through is that gender is something that is, as the quote states here, something that is navigated and negotiated every single day in a variety of different contexts, right? So there's this idea that being a man is this, but, right, there's always that clause that it's context dependent, that there's a number of other factors that influence how it is deemed appropriate or inappropriate for a man to behave under those conditions. Okay. One of the things I mentioned in the list of the forces that in culture and socialize us into gender is through play. And one of the most important forms of physical play that children engage in is sport. And so I wanted to highlight this study by Landers and Fine that looked at co-ed t-ball in the United States. And I discussed down here below that what's really interesting about their study was that even though these were co-ed teams, is that they found distinct differences in terms of how the boys on the team were treated from the girls, that there was a hierarchy that was established in terms of the positions that were being played, in terms of access and frequency of engaging directly with the ball or with the bat, right? So basically developing those important motor skills and those technical skills that are required to be successful in a sport, not just t-ball, but later on in baseball and softball. And also how encouragement was given also favored predominantly the boys over the girls. And they go on to say that what's interesting about this hierarchy, that even though this was a co-ed team and that a lot of the co-ed teams were focused on these ideas of equity and everyone being treated the same, was that parents also were reinforcing this hierarchy of different treatment, basically by how they offered more or less encouragement and how they did this along gender lines. And so I talk below how that praise and opportunity was unequally distributed amongst the boys as well, that those boys who presented what they argue, what Landers and Fine argue, are the ideal forms of masculinity or manliness, of athleticism in boys received more praise and opportunity than other boys who didn't show the same sort of technical skills, right? Or who were not as advanced in terms of skills. And I think part of the reason why I like this study as well is not only does it have some really clear outcomes that demonstrate, again, this idea of performing gender, that the boys who performed their gender as a boy were rewarded with having spots or positions like shortstop or first base where they had more free contact with the ball, but that it shows that this begins at a very young age, right? That kids who play t-ball are really little kids, right? That these are not teenagers, but these are little kids, and they're being exposed to these gender norms and these gender ideologies from a very young age, and they're learning the appropriate ways of behaving and thinking. The other thing we then have to think about are things like gendered toys. And so this here is just a Google image search when I Googled children's toy kitchen, and these were some of the first images that came up. And I think we're all familiar with this, although this is something that has been changed very significantly in the last few years. Major toy producers and distributors and sellers such as Toys R Us and Disney have actually removed some of the explicit gendered branding around their products, including Toys R Us, for example. And I know this as a parent because I go there every once in a while. They've removed headings like boys' toys and girls' toys. Instead, everything is organized and sorted by product. But what we then see is that gendering of toys still occurs in terms of things like colors, right? And what colors are appropriate, the kinds of toys and how they are sold to children, right? So if all we see are play kitchens, for example, they're only being presented in pink or in soft colors. And the only children who are represented playing with them are kind of stereotypical gender normative female children, then that is implicitly or subtly teaching children that these toys are for girls. And so Weisgrim et al. Wanted to look at this, that what was this impact then, that's explicit labeling and colors of toys. And what they found was that indeed that children tend to gravitate towards items that are labeled or branded towards their gender. So if you have a monster truck, for example, and you say, and you put it in a basket that's labeled boys' toys, then boys, individuals who identify as boys are more likely to play with them than individuals who don't. And then in that case, color doesn't seem to play as critical as a role. However, if you don't label it but with an explicit label, then sometimes color can have an impact. And again, what color is gendered, we talked about this way at the beginning of the term, depends on our own cultural values, right? So again, this is really important, and this is why we're starting to then see movements away from explicitly labeling and toys as gendered, and rather just seeing toys as age-based instead. And then I just provided a link here to a commercial for a toy store in the UK who was one of the first to really blow up this idea that toys are meant to be played with and everyone should be able to play with toys. And so they have this beautiful gender inclusive ad that makes me want to buy all the toys, but also support this excellent store who just recognizes, what it really is, the purpose and function of toys. And also, honestly, won't we just sell more toys if we can sell them to everyone versus selling them to only a certain percentage of our population? So I get that there's commercial economic understandings behind that as well. Okay. So we've already examined how gendered bodies and definitions around biological sex and how we engender cells and how all of these things have consequences in terms of parenthood, but we haven't actually looked at parenthood in terms of the roles that are being performed and how we are socialized into these gender roles, right? So it's clear that parents and gendered parents, such as fathers and mothers, do different things, right? Again, remember that the framework that we're kind of operating at as the normative is the heterosexual monogamous marriage. And this isn't to say it's the only one, but this is the narrative that is constantly reinforced by our culture, right? That there are fathers and there are mothers, and they do and perform different things within the household units, right? And so last class we looked at, or last week's topic, we looked at families and different kind of structures that those take. One of the other things we've also learned through cross-cultural comparison and studies is that being a parent means different things to men than it does to women. And so that's interesting as well, because it tells us something about how we've been socialized as men and women, or as individuals in general, towards what parenting should look like, what our roles are as parents, and also how we're supposed to think about parenting and what value it brings to our lives, etc. And then there's also consequences in terms of how children are also treated. And so what we have seen is that there is significant preference for sons over daughters. A lot of this is related to marriage systems, and remember, systems of descent and lineages, that it's more common cross-culturally to find patrilineal societies than matrilineal societies. And so because transmission of status and wealth is and property is through the male heirs or the male line, that it makes sense that individuals would want to have sons, because then the property and status, etc., is staying within that biological descent community, right? Because daughters, of course, are moving into their husbands' households and are becoming parts of those patrilineages. So let's just briefly look at motherhood. So you'll recall that way back when we looked at the Zuck reading, we looked at how this idea of motherhood and being a mom, that there's this kind of natural or innate maternal instinct, and we've debunked that. But now what I wanted to look at was the socialization of little girls into good mothers, and basically how we nurture girls into mothers. And a lot of this has to do, of course, with representation, but a lot of this also has to do with play, that again, the forms of play that girls are encouraged to engage in. And it's not honestly just play, it's also the labor roles that young girls are expected to perform in the household are often the same ones that they will then perform later on in life as a wife and a mother. Right. And this is also then supported by economic initiatives as well, where in many cases, the first job for young women is babysitting, is childcare, right? And of course, the media, as I mentioned, inundates females with images of motherhood, reinforcing it as the perfect life choice. Of course, this is something within Western culture that is starting to be challenged. I'd say that the rise of social media and the ability to open up people's homes and real experiences, to challenge notions of ideals versus reality, to address systems of inequity, all these different things, is that we're starting to get some different narratives, right? I don't think that motherhood as perfect and motherhood as preferred anymore is the kind of dominant narrative the way it was 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Right. But again, we still see this in some ways. So below in the notes, I talk about super moms, yummy mummies, and the real unrealistic expectations that are put on mothers and some of the consequences of this. And one of the consequences then is that it sets up a dichotomy, a false dichotomy, focused around things like labor, that there's something productive about being a member of our society who is a mother, that's seen as a valued form of labor. That you're then kind of chastised should you choose not to have children, should you not be able to have children, right? There's a number of reasons why people don't have children, but that this disproportionately affects women. And so there's consequences of this, right? Interviews, I think in the notes below, I talk about how interviews with Jennifer Aniston, for example, almost always focus on at least one question asking her about, is she satisfied with her choice not to have children? And again, it often frames that it becomes seen as a choice, right? And often a selfish choice, that only kind of arrogant, self-centered women would choose not to have children. So it kind of creates this false dichotomy that pits women against each other for choosing to perform different labor roles in society. What's interesting, however, is that while motherhood does seem to be by and large the preferred form of labor for women, it's also not compensated financially, right? And there's a lot of course, conversation around this right now under COVID. And so that leads us then to our next reading of the week, is how the roles and the labor that mothers perform that are meant to, or that are seen as expected behaviors, often reflect larger structural policies and beliefs, and as I mentioned here, ideological apparatus. So this is an excellent reading. This is my first time incorporating it into the course, so I'm excited to see what you folks have to say about this. But what it looks at is obentos, and obentos in nursery schools in particular. And so as I've summarized here, it's looking at how obentos are coded within Japanese culture, not just as a symbol of maternal or parental care for their child, but also as representing a larger ideological, cultural, and aesthetic apparatus in Japan, right? And so Allison does a great job of explaining this about how there's these, again, dichotomies that are constructed, that are built into it, that this focus on fresh, natural foods is emphasized, but these fresh, natural foods are then manipulated and shaped based into ideas around perfection and exactness, correctness, order, and responsibility. Indeed, a lot of focus is on responsibility, that it's not sufficient enough just for a mother to send their child with an obento, but the obento must be one that has several kind of components to it, not just kind of nutritional and health components, having sufficient food to meet the child's nutritional and also just energy needs and their hunger needs, but it also has to have this aesthetically pleasing, interesting, engaging aesthetic to it, such as the image I've pictured here. And so Allison then extrapolates that a lot of this has to do with then that the obento becomes a symbol of the mother's discipline, and then mother's discipline and her ability to execute it according to the standards of the school, of the state, then are taught to the child in turn, so that the child also learns the importance of orderliness, correctness, taking time and effort into your work, etc. Okay, so now let's shift to fatherhood. And I mean, it's clear that males are also subject to socialization of gender roles, right? And so I mentioned that cross-cultural comparisons of fatherhood show that regardless of lifestyle, geographical location, or standard of living, males are almost always required to pass a test, so to undergo a rite of passage in order to be accepted as a man. And so I've given you a couple of examples of rites of passage, but fatherhood is often a significant part of this, that either you are not really permitted to become a father until you've undergone the rite that sees you achieve full manhood within the society, or you're not fully accepted as a man in that society until you've had your first child. So often fatherhood is seen as an important part of that. So one of our readings this week as well is looking at fatherhood, and this is this work by Hewlett. And I kind of like the contrast that exists between the reading by Allison in the roles of mother and obento, and then we have Gilmore with this understanding of machismo, and Gilmore also talks about how young boys are taught the appropriate ways of behaving from their fathers in particular. And now we have Hewlett, who is providing yet another perspective on fatherhood. And so Hewlett's goals, and I think they're really notable for a course like this, is to provide a contrast to a lot of the mother-oriented theories. That part of the reason why we're able to focus on mothers so much in this course is because there's been so much studies done on infant and child development, on the mother-infant bond, on this in not just anthropology, but across many, many disciplines. That fatherhood and fathers, the roles of fathers and father-infant attachment hasn't been dedicated the same sort of attention. So Hewlett discusses this as well about why are fathers understudied. So they mentioned stuff like fathers as being less conspicuous in terms of the direct care that they're seen as providing to infants. Of course, we've looked at how this can be challenged under surrogacy, and then looks at the Aka people, a hunter-gatherer group from Central Africa, and looks at how basically father-infant bonding is a little bit different than what we see here in the West. And so Hewlett highlights some of the key traits of the culture more broadly that support the importance of the father-infant bond. So we see things like close kinship groups, family groups, as being very essential to survival, and the ability to share those resources is really critical. And so talks about subsistence practice, or how we get what we need to eat and to survive, facilitates the close proximity of infants and fathers, but also husbands and wives. So basically everything that parents and offspring do are in very close proximity to each other, which means that fathers have more frequency or frequent interactions with their children because they simply have more opportunity to interact with their children. And I think that's something we're now seeing in the West, is that with parents staying at home because of COVID, with the school closures, with people working from home, is that we're seeing household dynamics shift quite radically in some cases, because both parents are present, or one parent is present while the other parent now has to go to work. So childcare dynamics are all shifting. And so these relationships then between parents and their offspring are shifting as well. I think what's also important about this study is it says that it's not simply about proximity. Again, if we take a holistic approach, that there's also something about how young males are nurtured into adulthood and then into fatherhood, where they're encouraged to seek out their infants and to enjoy spending time and being with them. So Hewlett talks about how when they're sitting around drinking palm wine, I believe it is, that basically when all the dads are going to get together to hang out and chat with each other, they bring their infants with them, right? Where in our culture, usually when parents want to go out, they want to go out to get away from their children, so they leave their children at home. But in this case, the appropriate thing is, hey, I'm going out to see some friends, I'm going to take the baby with me, right? And so that is also facilitating this increased bond between fathers and infants. An old reading that I'm not assigning this term, it's no longer present in the text, is one by Townsend. And I thought it was important because what Townsend's reading, and so I've given you some detailed notes here, emphasizes is that in the West and in many parts of the world, that often the role that the father plays in his children's lives is shaped and influenced by women or by mothers, right? And so this is what Townsend refers to the mediating role of women. So talks about how many cultures still shape fatherhood as rewarding, and being a good father is rewarded as well, but it also then is packaged with other ideas around marriage, around heteronormativity, around heterosexuality, and the children as well. So Townsend goes on to talk about how things like often when a couple decides to have children, that is often put on the woman, who is often seen then as responsible for timing and birth control. And so sometimes disconnects can occur. And this relates to what we talked about with Martin's article about how people are taught about reproduction, is that often male individuals aren't informed about menstruation, ovulation, fertility, and they don't know that it's actually very normal to take up to 12 months of active trying in order for a heterosexual couple to become pregnant through heterosexual sexual intercourse, right? And so they often then find there's tension and struggle with this, whereas women who have been socialized and taught more around issues around fertility and infertility, around pregnancy and conception, around menstruation and ovulation, again, then the responsibility in the labor is often then performed or put on the women. So Townsend talks about then just the gendering of parenting, around how these structural divisions occur and these stereotypes, but also talks about the other social factors. And we're going to return to these ideas of this false dichotomy of home and work, of public and private, later on in the term when we look at subsistence practices a bit more in detail. But some of the key things that Townsend points out, again, is around this mediation of parenting. It is not only is the timing of when a couple or two individuals become parents is often seen as under the control of the woman or of the mother, but also that mothers often become the default parents. And this becomes manifested in a number of different ways, and has become very clear to me as I've become a parent and I've parented, is that if something happens with my child, everyone's first instinct seems to be is to contact me, right? It's like, you got to call the mom, you got to let the mom know what's going on, that moms often are the first point of contact. But this isn't always appropriate or necessary. And so why then do we have this idea of moms as being the ones who are responsible for children, right? Well, it's because of our cultural ideas around who is responsible for doing what in terms of gender division of labor, right? And so Townsend talks about how this gender division of labor then is often a reproduction of our parents' patterns or of our preference. So it's usually of our parents' patterns if we've had what we would consider ourselves personally a happy childhood, right? So if we grew up in a household where we felt our needs were being met, we were engaged with our parents, we were satisfied and overall felt loved and supported and nurtured, then we'll tend to reproduce those roles. However, if our experiences in childhood were not as well, let's just say happy in general or as fulfilling, or if there's tension or for whatever reason, we may choose to engage in other ways. So I always joke that an example of gender division of labor in my household that comes down to preference is, as a kid, one of my chores was to vacuum, and I hated vacuuming because according to my mom, I never did it right. But my mom also likes to vacuum like every day, so I didn't know why I had to vacuum once a week when she was vacuuming every single day anyways. And so I remember telling my husband when we first got married, I'm like, I'm not going to vacuum. I hate vacuuming. And he was like, okay, he doesn't mind vacuuming. But I like doing dishes and he doesn't. So that was a gender division or a gender division of labor that wasn't really based on gender. It was just simply based on our preference. But one of the things that's definitely gendered does seem to be the distribution of labor more broadly. And this, again, there's a lot of literature on this we can talk about in Blackboard Collaborate this week, showing how COVID has really highlighted just how unbalanced the gender division of labor is in households, but also how fathers benefit from the scheduling of fun as well. That part of being the default parent is that often the role of scheduling children's activities, their schoolwork, keeping track of where they are, who they're with, their comings and goings, their medical exams, all of their appointments, all of those things often fall on the mother's hand, which means then that often fathers benefit from being in control of their own schedules. And so this is what Townsend means by scheduling of fun, is that fathers then, because they're not responsible for scheduling children and managing that part of the household, their focus then on scheduling becomes, oh, well, where do I have opportunities to do the kinds of things I want to do, right? So we can talk about this a little bit more about how your experiences may have varied, but I think there's some really interesting ideas that come up around this. And I think one of the problematic things about Townsend's reading is that Townsend directly questions whether female control of the family is something that is quote unquote jealously guarded, or if this is something that happens as a result of men basically accepting this division of labor because they see domestic work and childcare as less prestigious and less important. Townsend concludes that the answer is both, and I'd be interested to see what your insights are on this. Okay. So this was just something that came up in my social media that I thought I'd share with you that talks about some of the consequences then of gender division of labor and how it plays out in childhood as well, that often we teach children what roles, as I mentioned, again, they'll perform in adulthood by how we assign things like chores. And I'll just note that in my household, one of the things, being aware of this, that I really wanted to do was make sure that my child was given opportunities and to be fair, I mean, she's coming from a very privileged household with two working parents, with stable incomes, both university educated, and she's an only child, so she gets all of our attention. But one of the things I consciously had chosen to do with her and had talked about explicitly with my husband, with her dad, was that I didn't want her learning only kind of gendered labor. That, to me, a more important metric of a child's ability or capacity to perform a task relates to their age, right? So I'm not going to force my 7.5-year-old daughter to go out and get a job so she can bring in cash into our household. That is, I deem that's inappropriate. We can talk about, child labor later on in the term. But I do believe that her collecting the garbages from the various garbages in the different rooms of the house and bringing them downstairs so we can take them out to the curb on garbage day is something that she's capable of doing. She has also volunteered and offered to take on certain forms of labor in our household. So she loves taking care of our cat. So she feeds our cat and makes sure that the cat's various water bowls around the house are filled. She likes taking care of the plants, so she waters the plants. She helps with dishes. again, the idea is that she's learning important life skills, but ones that are not assigned on the basis of gender, but based on her either interest or her physical capacity, right? Like, I'm not going to expect her to go chop wood for the fireplace, because that's a dangerous and inappropriate task for a 7.5-year-old, at least in my opinion, right? But she is allowed to use a small paring knife and help chop up veggies for supper, something that she actually really enjoys doing, right? So I think this is something, again, we can talk more about some of these examples of why are we taught certain forms of labor to perform certain things as children, then expected to perform them in adulthood, and what are other things that we think are maybe more universally important skills that everybody should learn, and are they gendered, and maybe if they are gendered, why, how, and how should we challenge this? So for example, changing a tire is a skill that anyone who owns a vehicle should know how to do, right? There's no need for gender for that, and often there's consequences that we belittle individuals who don't know how to do this, right? But often it's because we are all a product of our cultural learning. Okay, so clearly, and I said I wanted to talk a lot about this in Blackboard this week, so I'll kind of skim over the next few points. That one of the most important ways in which we learn how to perform gender, the important ways of thinking and feeling and behaving as a gendered member of society, is through the media. And so just a quick data point from 2010, I'm sure this has gone up in the last year in particular, right, with COVID, but also with the absolute explosion of all the different platforms of social media over the last 5 years, that children and young adults are accessing more than 10 hours of media a day. And I'd like you to think about how many hours a day you're accessing media. And this is on top of the scheduled work that you have to pull from online environments, right? Like, this is just purely how you're engaging with it outside of the norm, right? And so as such, if we even think about 10 hours of media a day as the kind of standard, this is amazing, right? That we are massive consumers of media, therefore it has become our predominant means of learning cultural values and gender norms. And the reason why I mentioned children and young adults is that, and I talk about this below, that individuals' brains are not considered to be fully developed until age 24, which means that for a quarter of our possible lifespan, we are subject to media's messages that are helping our brain grow and form neural pathways, right? And the more we think about those ideas, the more rigid and more developed these neural pathways become, right? So the media clearly is shaping our cultural norms and attitudes around gender, right? And this is why in many ways, it's hard to talk about gender without it becoming heteronormative, because I know for me in particular, this is what I was raised in a culture where you were male or female. And that was about it, right? And so this is because the media that I was exposed to reinforce these ideas, right? Reinforce gender stereotypes, but also normalizes other, what we might say, kind of negative behaviors. So sexism, toxic monogamy, toxic heterosexuality, and then there's also something called queer baiting that can also happen that also then reinforces heteronormativity as well. So I provided some discussion about this as well. I like to use the show Friends as an example of toxic monogamy. And this is not to say that all monogamy is toxic. That's certainly not the case. But like any relationship structure, like any institution or cultural institution, there can be negative consequences in terms of kind of the more extreme forms of it. And I think Friends is an example where we see lots and lots of examples of toxic monogamy, including things like jealousy, possessiveness, lack of agency, etc. Okay. There's also other ways that the media, of course, shapes stereotypes, such as our perception of bodies. And so I provided you two really interesting studies that were done where they took a model of one woman, and then they sent her to 18 different basically like graphic design studios where people do ads and stuff like that, or an ad company. And what they found was that in different countries is that it revealed what they say it revealed what are the beauty standards. So you can see here that there's 3 images. And this, again, is the same model, the exact same image they're working with, but the designers modified the image, photoshopped the image to represent the ideal woman. And so we can see that there's some differences in terms of overall body shape and form, even whether or not her how her hair was parted, how much of her hair is seen behind her neck, and what side her hair is parted on. So in this case, this photo's been flipped to the other side. Some of the images, they've changed her shoe color and her underwear color as well, but you can see lots of differences in terms of her skin tone, face, eye shape, skin color, different proportions of body fat, lack thereof, or a thigh gap or lack thereof. All of these different things have all been altered. And one of the things that has consistently been shown is that we are exposed to a disproportionate number of images of women as being young, white, heterosexual, and underweight. Turns out, though, that of course, and we shouldn't be surprised that men are also subject to these, that so they did the exact same thing where they took the single image of this guy, of this male, and then they sent it to 18 agencies around the world, and they were photoshopped. And you can see that in some ways, the male photoshopping is even more extreme than what we saw in the female photoshopping, that they've altered his hairstyle, his facial hair, his body hair, the muscularity of his torso, his skin color, even the positioning of his arms in some cases. His stance has been changed. The one for Russia blows my mind that it's even the same person, because they've altered the physicality so much, but also, again, his hair and some of his facial attributes have been shifted as well. The problem with this is the negative outcomes, and how these stereotypes and these representations or misrepresentations then of diversity in what humans look like, both in terms of genders, right? We've now learned that men and women are not the only genders, or male and female are not the only genders that are available or even acceptable to many cultures. So why are we only seeing them represented in the media? And part of this is because of how they then contribute to ongoing inequity in our society. That the current gender norms we have do disproportionately limit women and girls socially, economically, and politically more so than we see males. That often how women are framed as well is very narrowing. So I love this post from Everyday Sexism, where they're looking at the Time headline, which was Amal Clooney shows off her baby bump at the United Nations. Right? And you might be like, well, why is Time tweeting about this? Well, Amal Clooney is famously described as the wife of George Clooney. But what Everyday Sexism is trying to point out is that the reason why Amal Clooney was at the United Nations is that she is a world-renowned, highly respected human rights lawyer. She was not showing off her baby bump. She happened to be pregnant when she went to work on a human rights tribunal case at the United Nations, right? So how we talk about genders, how we talk about individuals as gendered in the media reinforces our cultural narratives and stereotypes, right? So the Time headline is emphasizing Amal Clooney as the wife of George Clooney, right, by using her married name, by not using her title, by focusing on her as a pregnant woman and not by her labor or profession to explain why she was at the United Nations. But representation of men and boys and manualness and masculinity are also just as limiting as well, right? And we'll talk about how this kind of plays out a bit differently in terms of equity and equity. But the reality is that it still represents a lot of time a form of what we call toxic masculinity. And again, masculinity itself is not inherently toxic. I talk about this in the notes, but rather there are forms that are very toxic, that are limiting and harmful towards men and boys, right? Or individuals who adopt masculinity as part of their gender identity, right? So in the media, what do we see? Lots of representations of men as violent, in control, unemotional, or treating women like objects or second-class citizens. Inversely, and I see this all the time in radio ads, and this drives me crazy, but TV shows are really bad about this as well, is showing men as goofs, right, or incompetent. So there's like the CanadaJobShop.ca ads. And no, I'm not promoting them here, but if you listen to them, if you listen to the radio, the boss is always this kind of dingus, right? Like he's always so confused and oblivious, and he needs his secretary who is his inferior and is being played by a woman, right, to step in and save him so that he doesn't cost the company more money. We see this often in terms of how dads and fathers are represented in popular culture and movies, right? That dads are not only those who play with their children, who engage in roughhousing, but also are those who are kind of silly or incompetent, who forget the kids' appointments, who don't know the children's middle names or their ages, right? And this is harmful and limiting as well. Of course, whiteness is ubiquitous, right? That we see that men are often represented as white. So if we think about kind of action figures and toys and other forms of representation, sports are often emphasized as a means for showing that you're masculine. But there have been steps towards this. So I love this joke. It's seen to be a joke or gag gift, but really what it's doing is critiquing the idea that, we think of nurses as being female. So this is a male nurse. So they have to emphasize it's male nurse, much like we talk about female astronauts. We gender positions, and we'll talk about this again with labor more. There's a lot of controversy when The Force Awakens, when Star Wars Episode 7 came out, because they released this action figure set. And the big question was, where's Rey? Rey is basically the main character of the Skywalker trilogy, as it's now known, or as the sequels. And she's missing from the toys, right? We have luckily, we have some nice diversity in terms of we have, our Poe and our Finn. So our Finn is represented here, and a black male. But yeah, everyone else, like we don't even have Phasma, who's this badass. Instead, we still have a female stormtrooper. And instead we just have other just generic stormtroopers. So where's Rey? Why do we not see these in toys? How is this branded? And this was actually resulted in a radical backtrack by Hasbro and Disney, who then really focused on amping up things that were focused on Rey. Okay, so I'm talking about this a little bit more. I talk about this as well, that a form of toxic toxic masculinity often relates to toxic monogamy, and this idea of fathers as owning or having ownership over their daughters and controlling their behaviors and their actions, and denying their daughters agency over things like daughter sexuality. And so this is an example of a toxic shirt in the upper left-hand side versus a bottom shirt. And you might see stuff like this on Facebook, that we've again kind of normalized these kind of narratives, but they are harmful and problematic, because the one in the top in particular denies daughters agency, right? The right to consent to engage in sexual activities with their own body, right? So there's been a lot of movements in the last few years re-examining media representation, questioning this and challenging this. So I love this work that was done where they took a Girls' Life magazine and then reimagined it, kind of changing it. So it's funny, the subtitle is Suck It Girls' Life, kind of challenging the ideas of, well, what are we teaching girls? What are we focusing on when we are selling products and goods to girls, right? So if you look at the one on the left-hand side, a standard girls magazine or teen magazine, right? Your dream hair, fashion, wake up pretty, my first kiss, are you ready for a boyfriend, right? Buy drama, friendship rules, all these things. Well, are these the things that we want girls to focus on, that we want girls to care about? Is this all that's going on in girls' lives? And this alternative magazine goes, well, no. It talks about things like girls doing good, helping each other in the communities, focusing on healthy days, how to work hard to create the best you ever, confidence. And I love this idea that my first miss, something that we teach all children not very well, is how to fail and rebound from that, resilience, right? Getting ready to live your dreams. Why is there drama? Like being more critical about it rather than just being like swearing to abide by certain rules. Being more critical and retrospective and thinking about, well, how can I live a life that doesn't have drama in it? How can I build healthier relationships? So I love this. And they included their cover girl here is Olivia Halsey, the 2015 Google Science Fair Grand Prize winner. And I love this inspiring byline, right? You could be next, right? And it's not only if she can see it, will she, or can she, or she can be it, but it's also if he can see it, will he be it? And again, a recent study, and I've linked the PDF of the study here, talks about how top-rated TV content created for boys reinforces male stereotypes and reinforces a lot of these toxic stereotypes as well, right? So some of these stereotypes are good. Things like self-sufficiency, but unfortunately the self-sufficiency in young boys is represented as always coming with the cost that they don't have parents, that they don't have often adults in their lives who are taking care of them, so they have to learn to become resilient and take care of themselves. Often this then is accompanied by things like acting tough and risky behavior. When parents are present, they're often subpar, and then again the men themselves are then shown as subpar parents, that somehow fathers are always inferior to mothers, and this is problematic, as you can see. They note that in the study they did that the most prominent stereotype was that men are represented as aggressors, right? That male characters commit 62.5% of violent acts against another person. And this kind of form of gendered violence is really important, because if all you're seeing is that men are always the ones being violent, then you come to just accept that as normal. You don't blow it off. You don't see that as a problem, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, right? If we're seeing this representation, does that reflect the reality of violence? Or do we have a circle or a feedback loop wherein boys are more violent because they're being shown that they should be and can be more violent? Therefore, this creates more violence by males, etc., right? So if we want to break that cycle, we have to be critical of these representational or these representations in the media. What's also interesting, as they found, was that this violence is often male on male, that male individuals are often represented and are more likely than female characters to be victims of violence as well. So I think it's really important that we have to question this, right? What do we see? What does this tell us who we can be? And again, I just want to emphasize here that when we see, before we talk about violence, so this will be a bit of a content warning, I'm going to talk about violence a little bit more, so if you need to step away from the video, you can. And the rest of the video, I'll just talk about some of the ridiculous ways that we gender products that don't seem to make any sense other than reinforcing stereotypes. But that you can see that, again, a lot of the media representations are heteronormative, that other genders are not being adequately and accurately represented in media. And so we need to be not only critical about how we're seeing masculinity and femininity, or males and females, or mothers and fathers being represented in our media, but we also need to be critical about how gender is being represented, period, about what family structures are being represented. Are they really reflecting our societal norms and the diversity of people in our society, or are they just continuing to persist in perpetuating stereotypes that no longer reflect who we are as a society or as a culture? So I did want to mention briefly here gender violence, that when we talk about gender violence, we talk about forms of violence that are shaped by the gender identities of the people involved. It takes a number of different forms, and I'll post some resources for everyone. I think it's useful for you to know on campus. So I've mentioned before, I'm a sexual violence support guide at MacEwan, and it's really important to me that people feel supported, but they're also aware that gender violence affects everyone, and that it takes a number of different forms. And we take a very inclusive definition to gender violence at MacEwan that looks at everything from verbal abuse and stalking and harassment to any sort of form of psychological or physical threat taken against other people. But we can also consider structural gendered violence, about the kind of gendered societal patterns of unequal access to wealth, power, and resources that differentially affect people. And when I was talking about power in a previous week, I mentioned, for example, invisible power, and how an example of invisible power at work is how for a long period missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was made a non-issue by our governments, that it was not talked about, it was dismissed, that missing women, Indigenous women and girls, were set aside as runaways or as engaging in lifestyles where they basically framing them as if they deserved to go missing, that they deserve the violence that was being inflicted upon them. As you can imagine, I do not believe that this is the case at all. I think that this is one of the biggest atrocities that has happened in Canada in recent years. I think it's a problem that's been persistent for a very long time because of colonialism that has made Indigenous people invisible in our society, and it has continued to marginalize them and stereotypically set them aside as others, right? So, I think these are important things that we have to consider. And next, a topic, we're going to look at how this objectification of women, that violence towards women in the media, this representation of toxic masculinity, of males as aggressors and as violent individuals, has consequences in terms of things like how women running for politics, and so we'll look at that. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the ongoing problem that we still have as well around violence against transgendered and homosexual individuals. In general, every day we mark the Transgender Day of Remembrance to mark those individuals who were murdered simply because of their gender. So it has serious consequences, right? Some of these representations in the media seem kind of not harmful. And what's the harm of having stereotypes if this is what people want to be? But there can be harm. And it can be used to reinforce a culture where violence against people on the basis of their gender occurs and will continue to occur. So we, again, have to be critical about the media we consume and the media we produce. So I've talked about other forms of gender bias in the rest of the slides here. Things about how, if we start to think about the intersection of gender and age, about, well, why do we engender children's clothing to some way? And so there's this wonderful article that was written by a parent, by a mother, to Land's End, wondering, why in the world are you engendering snow pants? Like, they're all the same cut. They're all the same sizes, but based on their color, some were being sold as girls' pants and others as men's pants or as boys' pants, right? And the only difference between the girls' ones and the boys' ones were the color, right? So why is light blue the boys' ribs and why is other colors part of the boys' bibs, right? So is basically challenging these ideas and saying how these then become limiting, and then these stereotypes then become enforced, because even though her son loved, I think it was teal or aqua or turquoise, he wouldn't buy them because on the previous page they were represented and shown as girls' pants. Okay. Again, the gendering of products can happen in a number of different ways, and sometimes it can be silly. There's whole threads of this on the media that shows the pointless gendering of products, and I like ones that are more ridiculous. And again, they kind of show this idea of how people actually also get really angsty and angry about not having products be gendered when really there's no need for it. So like shampoo for men, and then shampoo apricot. So I love this. Are you a boy or an apricot? Like, these are the two genders. Or how about this? Are you a girly girl or are you North American? Like, what? They're binoculars. Like, how does this impact how these are being used? And then we get stuff like this. So these are laxative tablets. And so the question is, well, why are they being gendered? Like, don't we all have kind of the same guts? And if not, what's the reason? And what was interesting about these ones in particular is that these products have no difference. And the article talks about this, that they have the exact same ingredients in them. Everything is the same, except for the one branded for the women is referred to as the woman's gentle laxative with dependable overnight relief. It's pink, so we know it's for women. And my favorite part is that it's the new value size, but it has less tablets than just the regular ones. So again, we have to think about, and I talk about this in the notes below, things like pink washing. Like, why do we have laxative tablets for women if they're not actually changed in any tangible way as a product? Like, the packaging is definitely different and how they're being sold is definitely different, right? As gentle for sensitive stomachs, right? Well, if women have more sensitive stomachs, then shouldn't the product itself be altered in order to accommodate that? And also, why would you lie and say it's value sized when there's definitely less? And they actually talk about it the article how the woman's product, the value size one, was actually cost more than the regular product, right? So what was the point of that? So you're paying more money for less for simply a pink box that says, well, it's for you because you're a woman. Okay. So I've also provided you some links. Originally, you were going to have a written assignment where you can compare and contrast. But these are just some really great documentary films that have come out over the last years, looking at, again, some of the larger issues around the media and representation when it comes to gender. So Misrepresentation was the first film that was made by this director, looking at, again, the representation of women and young girls in the media. And then The Mask You Live In is now the other side of the heteronormative coin, right? So I have posted the film review questions for these, but you're not required to watch these films. But if you're interested more in looking at how the media shapes our understanding of gender and how we then behave as gendered individuals, these are some really great films. And my understanding is these have popped up on Netflix quite a bit as well. So, but again, you can access them for free through our library streaming service. So be sure to add any of the terminology ongoing to the wiki page, and I look forward to discussing this topic with you in our Blackboard Collaborate session this week. Take care, everyone.